break, and I now welcome back representatives from Australian Grape and Wine, the Code Management Committee and Wine Australia, our last witnesses for today. I'll go to you first. Anne, I'll go to you first. So I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you each please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? I might start with you first, Dr. Waters.
So, Liz Waters, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Wine Australia.
Thank you.
Martin Cole, Chief Executive Officer for Wine Australia.
Ashley Keegan, and representative of the Code Management Committee of Australian Grape and Wine.
Thank you.
Lee McLean, I'm the Chief Executive of Australian Grape and Wine.
Great. Does anyone have an opening statement they'd like to make?
Just a very brief one, given
Please,
the time,
yes.
if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
you could table your extended statement if you
that's fine, yeah. So, be very brief. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. Obviously, Wine Australia is a statutory body under the Commonwealth with three primary functions under the Wine Act in terms of research and development around competitiveness, improving the competitiveness of wine, marketing of wine to improve the image and quality and price paid for wine, and we're also a regulator, so we regulate exports, etc., and that's about protecting the reputation of wine. So clearly the terms of this inquiry fall outside the prescribed functions for Wine Australia under the Act. However, I will reassure the committee that we recognise the outcomes of this inquiry will have an influence on the sector's operating environment, and that's something certainly in this role we've been very conscious of as in our extensive work and consultations with the sector. So to conclude, so our role really today is to provide data and insights that might enable more informed decisions by the committee. We look forward to continue to work with the committee, sector representatives, government, etc., and really to try and plot a successful course for the sector. Look forward to taking any questions and any other support that Wine Australia can give to this committee. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I will now go to Senator Ruston. Oh, sorry. Did anyone else have opening statements? Please go.
If I may, thanks, Senators, for doing the work that you're doing on behalf of our industry in some of the most tumultuous times. My name is Ashley Keegan. I'm here as a proxy for Mr Peter Hayes, who's the independent chairman of the Code Management Committee. Unfortunately, Peter's unable to attend due to international travel, and I've been asked to give you, lend you my position from a code management perspective. I've been on the committee for since November 2020. And whilst I'll answer the questions to the best of my ability in the context of the Code Management Committee, it's probably may be helpful for you to frame your questions to me with a bit of an understanding. I'm a commercial grape grower. The next vintage is my 28th vintage that I undertake, and I started growing a family vineyard, then went through vineyard management, chief viticulturist roles, executive roles, and I now find myself as a CEO of a very large vineyard management and grape growing enterprise. I operate over 4 states across Australia, look after 20 sites, but predominantly what I do is grow grapes and sell them to wine companies. Last year I grew for over 40 different wine companies. So in addition to my day job, I volunteer as obviously a member of the Code Management Committee, but I'm also humbled and daunted by the responsibility as the chair of the Vignerons Committee for Australian Grape and Wine, where I do my best to create a voice for Australian grape growers across the country. And with that role, I cascade onto the board of Australian Grape and Wine as well. I think, look, I'm not going to go into the detail of the code. You understand that, you've seen the submissions, but I think what I can do is try to give you a bit of an operating perspective on how the committee operates, give you an understanding of that. And I think we come together as a really quite a diverse group of people with that 50-50 split between grape growers representatives and winemaker representatives. We're also very lucky to have Paul Derrico and Jeremy Cass as observers from the Riverina and the Murray Valley area. Whilst they're not voting members, when we get inside the room, they're team members, and we thrash out what we need to thrash out in the context of the code. We've got a really clear administrative and management responsibility within the code, but what I really like to do is the fact that we get to capacity to sort of monitor and influence that document as a living, breathing document as the industry morphs, and the rate of change that's happening within the industry is acute at the moment. So that flexibility that we've got and that leadership under Peter Hayes, where we lean into those issues and deal with things that are cropping up. The code's not perfect, but it is an effective tool for guiding industry, navigating the supply chain within the industry relationships. In my 4 years of experience, I've watched it have some palpable impacts on the interactions and the relationships along the supply chain for those who are signatories. I watched it do very little for those who are not signatories as well. And on that note, I'll finish my opening remarks, and I look forward to answering any questions that I can help you with.
Yeah, thank you for your remarks, Mr. Keegan. We've certainly seen some really raw human emotions today of people who are suffering, significant uncertainty in their lives, and simple things as making a living and keeping their traditions going. So thank you for acknowledging that. Senator Ruston.
You're right, Mr. McLean.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, Senator. Look, I think it might be worthwhile just making a short opening statement to provide some context, if that's okay. So thank you very much for your time, Senators, for being here and for allowing me to make this this statement. Lee McLean's my name. I'm the Chief Executive of Australian Grape and Wine, Australia's National Association of Winemakers and Winegrape Growers. Our aim is really to work as the interface between the industry and political decision makers in Canberra, where I'm based, and I've got a team here in Adelaide as well. The organisation was established in 2019 via the amalgamation of the Winemakers Federation of Australia, so the winemakers body, and Australian Vignerons, the growers body, at that point in time. And that was driven really by a desire broadly shared across the industry and government at the time for the sector to speak with a single voice, underpinned by a mature forum for developing policy positions on a range of issues. Ours is a really diverse sector, and brokering consensus on issues can often be difficult, particularly when times are tough as they are now. But the system we have in place allows growers and winemakers to work on issues collaboratively, and this is a powerful thing. A lot has been said today about the state of the industry. I won't labour that point too much, but what I will say is that at the heart of the issues that we're hearing about, and you're right, Senator, there was an enormous amount of real emotion and pretty heartbreaking stories that we're hearing. At the heart of this is this imbalance between supply and demand that we're seeing in Australia, particularly for red wine. Resolving this imbalance is fundamental to driving those stronger commercial relationships along the supply chain. The Code of Conduct for Australian wine grape purchase is a critical tool for fostering fair, equitable and mutually beneficial relationships between growers and winemakers. I won't go too much into it. You've heard a lot about the code already today, but what I will note is that over time it has evolved and it's been able to react to things as they've come up. So we've seen improvements in things like minimum standards for grape purchasing agreements, quality assessments and payment terms over time. We've also worked hard to increase the number of signatories to the code, going from about 44 when it was first developed to 83 most recently, and that represents roughly more than half of all wine grape purchases in the country. Of course, we want to see more coverage than that. Despite these improvements, we can understand there's a growing discussion about the need for a mandatory code, or the value of a mandatory code. We hear that loud and clear. While AGW, as we're known, has a preference for preserving the voluntary code that we have and strengthening it, we are also open-minded to looking at what regulation could look like in the future, or further regulation. But to Mr Petty's point earlier today, consultation will be critical in any of that. There are real potential risks associated with mandating a code, particularly when we don't know what that code actually looks like in practice. So we're crystal ball gazing a little bit. We don't want to set unrealistic expectations about what a code can actually achieve. And we really want to make sure that we're recognising, as the ACCC did, that our sector is incredibly diverse, 65 regions, more than 100 varieties, and lots of different business models within that. So in conclusion, supply and demand remains that critical issue for us. That's what we're trying to work on that with government at the moment. But we are open to having those conversations about how we can improve commercial dealings over time as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Ruston. Finally, my fault.
Just a question, Dr. Cole. Can we market our way out of the problem that the wine industry in Australia has currently got?
Can you
market our way out of the challenges that are before the industry?
I think yesterday we just published an update to our stock to sales ratio, This is an annual survey that we do on behalf of the sector. There are some pleasing trends and directions there, but so the stock to sales ratio is down to still above the 10-year average, but at 1.83. That's for reds. So whites are in balance, reds are in oversupply still. The reason why that has come down is because of the 2 last year's vintages, though. It's really on the supply side. Yeah. So I think the answer's not, kind of one thing or the other. I think we probably are going to still continue to have an issue with oversupply. The China numbers are very pleasing in terms of exports. So I think our last export report talked about over 600 million in value, but it's a premium, principally a premium play, China at the moment, and so it's not really alleviating from a volume standpoint. So that's the equivalent of 600 million litres. So even with the pleasing trends, we're still dealing with an oversupply. So all of the things that we are talking about in terms of both on the supply side, getting better handle on the supply side, to the work we're proposing to do on the National Vineyard Register to actually get better data to inform decisions on the supply side, but market diversification and all of the promotion work we do is also going to be just as important, but no silver bullet, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It seems quite extraordinary that we're sitting here in 2024 and we don't even know how many grapes we've got in the ground or what they are.
That's correct.
But are you seeing any resistance from growers providing you with that information?
We did quite an extensive consultation with the One Sector Plan, and that was, I think, overwhelmingly positive to get that information. We also did quite a bit of consultation through the Viticulture and Wine Working Party, and that was positive too. It's a polarising issue. We are getting some folks saying that they're kind of negative towards that, but overwhelmingly I think most people are seeing the benefit for that work. We have some pieces of the jigsaw. So in South Australia, you'll know Vine Health with the phylloxera. Yeah, we have very good data. Some of the folks that you've heard from today play a role for their region. Paul Dorigo, Jeremy Cassidy wasn't here today. They play a role in their regions, in terms of grape growers, providing that service. But it's not in a form that's joined up nationally where we can actually do some predictions. What's in the ground by region, by variety. That information, I think, will be a critical piece to understanding the supply and demand side. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Keegan, by the very nature of why you're here, the Code Management Committee, I'm really interested to understand, where do you sit as a committee in relation to the success or otherwise of the current voluntary code?
I think I look back on the detail of the examples of the code with disputes and acknowledgements to the Secretariat, and we're watching that curve fall away. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago there was maybe 50 notifications, and then 34 down to sort of a handful at the moment. I think the voluntary code is very effective when you've got signatories and participants that are just in a disagreement. What I find is it's where there's non-signatories or participants operating outside of that. This year, AGW created an environment where if a grower just had an issue, they weren't sure on what they were doing, they weren't understood the process from a code point of view, they could contact AGW and they would get an opportunity to have an independent, confidential conversation. This year that was with me, and so I would have growers call me and ask me questions about a scenario. They just want to bounce something off the wall. I think probably more than half of those conversations were pertaining to non-signatories, and so I'm not a lawyer and I'm not their lawyer. I'm just trying to create opportunities for them and explain to them how they may go about managing some of those issues.
So taking that one step further, what do you think the main benefits of moving to a mandatory code would be, and what are the downsides that you can see from where you're sitting?
Yeah, look, I think the the main benefit of going to a mandatory position is if I had a magic wand, I'd have everybody as a signature. So that would be one of the criteria, depending on the thresholds and the nature of that, the detail, which obviously we don't understand at this point in time. One of my concerns from a mandatory perspective is, again, I don't know what I don't know about how the market will morph on that. What are the unintended consequences? And I recently gave a presentation along with the ACCC and Bruce Bills, and my comments were that I used an example. I'm a CEO of a grape growing entity, but if I took that hat off and put myself as a CEO of a small to medium wine business, how would I react? What would I do if certain hurdles and scenarios were put in my place? And I think we heard earlier from some of the growers earlier this morning saying that there's a fear that we might see the market shift towards wine buying. And as a consequence, my biggest fear as a grape grower today is that I'm not worried about price, I'm just worried about someone buying my grapes. So I don't yet have the luxury on many of my grapes is to worry about price. I just don't have a home for it. And therefore, from a perspective, if I don't have the home for it, you know, and the market morphs to a wine buying situation, then I've got a decision to make. I either have to become a winemaker or I, make some structural changes to the business.
So just, you've made some comments, and I think you all in your other submissions around supply chain. So we're talking here about a code that potentially could become mandatory between the relationship between the grower and the producer or the manufacturer. Mm-hmm. I'm interested to understand what your role as the code committee is in understanding. You've then got to move up to the next level in the supply chain, which is obviously in Australia, your retailer, and then internationally the global market. I'm just interested to understand, if you put a mandatory code in this piece of the relationship, what then do you think is likely to happen on the next piece of the relationship if there isn't a similar sort of mandatory requirement for behaviour? Which you can't do in an international marketplace, but I suppose you can within a domestic marketplace. It sort of seems to me that without the continuum of sort of mandating throughout the sort of whole supply chain, it's all going to end up at the place where it breaks.
Yeah, Senator, probably a difficult one for me to answer simply because at the Code Management Committee, I'm 100% focused on that grower to winemaker relationship as my day job, where I'm a commercial grape grower. I don't necessarily interact with the supply chain, the retail or that space. So,
but your decisions are going to impact on that supply chain, because as soon as you put an artificial sort of impediment into a system, there will be consequences, and you need to understand what those consequences are. When we heard earlier comments similar to your concerns about what happens to the market if you do this. And you end up with a market that doesn't actually buy grapes anymore, or a market that just sort of trades in bulk wine. I mean, keen to understand, there is a very strong view that has been expressed today by growers that they want greater protection and support around their contractual arrangements with the people they're supplying their grapes to, and I don't think anybody can blame them for that. But we need to be really clear about, if you do that, what are the consequences? So who is best placed to provide that accurate information if it isn't the Code Committee itself?
About the further reaching implications of putting
if we are going to put a mandatory code in place, we need to be very clear about what's going to happen. Because the last thing you want to do is, for all the best intentions, to actually cause the grape growers a bigger problem they've currently got. Oh, please,
perhaps, Senator, I might shed some light on this. In the review process that Dr. Emerson is undertaking at the moment, he is looking at the entire supply chain from the vineyard through to the retail shelf. That's the first time anyone has ever really taken that whole of supply chain look within Australia, notwithstanding the fact that it's very difficult to look at export markets. But there is a body of work being undertaken at the moment. Again, to my earlier point, when we're talking about codes, mandating codes, we need to know what they actually look like and what they mean. So there needs to be a really strong level of consultation right across that value chain. I note that some of the previous people who've spoken today have mentioned the need for that sort of look at the entire supply chain. That's something that we support as well. Although ascertaining exactly what that code looks like and what's going to be helpful on the supply chain is still yet to be determined. But I think there is absolutely value in having that visibility of how those relationships are playing out right along the chain.
Okay. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I might go to you next. I'm going to have a few questions to wrap it up.
Thank you. Mr. Keegan, you have an interesting perspective from a range of different viewpoints about what's happening in the industry. I wonder if you have any general observations to make about power in the industry between smaller inland growers, for example, and wine makers, because I think that's at the heart of a lot of the evidence we've heard.
Yeah, it's an interesting look. At the end of the day, you've heard on several occasions in different market environments, I've seen the power go in the other direction, and I used to use the analogy as to who's got the baseball bat, as to depending on where the market is from a supply-demand perspective, and I've seen growers use that baseball bat in a way that I don't think is necessarily correct, and similarly I've seen decisions come back the other way that are harsh and pretty tough. I think as a supply chain, maybe to Senator Ruston's comment, end-to-end supply chain is what we really need to be. We need to be symbiotic, not parasitic, and we need to do everything that we can, and every step that we make, and whether we end up with a mandatory code, is to try to build symbiosis into the relationship, not a parasitic situation, because for too long our industry has been through this boom and bust cycle, and we continue to replicate that if we don't change the way we go about doing that. I would sort of, and again, my earlier point, I feel the responsibility of being chair of the Vignerons Committee heavily, because I do sit at a table. I do have the ability to have conversations across the table with some of the largest wine companies, and pass comment on how we go about interacting with each other. And there's some fantastic examples, and we've heard a few examples where wine companies have gone above and beyond to help growers in difficult situations. I think I reflect on the fact that the situation at the moment is so tough. It's the toughest I've ever seen in my career. And even those friendships, those long-term, decade-long relationships are starting to not be enough. When we get on an aeroplane, we're told when the mask falls down, put the mask on yourself first and then worry about the kids. And I think we're in such a duress that we're not far off that. Each business has got to look after themselves to get through, and we're seeing these short-term reactive thinking. And you've heard again multiple times today that whether it's mandatory, prescribed, voluntary, that's not fundamentally going to change our supply-demand situation. And I just see so much duress, and we point at these different things, but really, if we had a better balance, then I think some of those issues become secondary issues. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be the best that we can be in the systems that we put in place, and maybe think to the future about the next time. But it's fundamentally a situation where that supply-demand imbalance is super tough.
I think you said in your opening comments that we mustn't be place unrealistic expectations on the code to deliver a rescue in what's in a very extreme set of circumstances. I take that point. But we also have heard from growers who are in extremis, who don't have much power, who feel intimidated about even asking about price. In this circumstance, the code is applying to some, and we've heard some evidence of very good practice that's well beyond and above the code standards, but other places where that is not the case. And growers are looking to the Senate and putting evidence forward to argue for a minimum set of protections. In that light, in an industry in extremis, can you understand that argument and see merit in it?
Yeah, no, definitely, Senator. And again, I feel the responsibility sitting across tables like this with the major winemakers, and if I become aware of those, then I'm prosecuting those arguments and asking people to be accountable for the decisions that we're making, and reminding everybody that behind every tonne is a human being, and human beings in serious risk of well-being, and that we all need to look beyond the tonne and the dollar and be human beings at the end of it. So you know, the duress is palpable in that context. But again, we need to be careful about the solution that we got, or you know, climbing the ladder and making sure it's leaning up against the right wall in the context of what we're trying to achieve.
And Mr McLean, you said you remained open-minded about the role of the code becoming mandatory. Do you see benefits out of it becoming mandatory?
Potentially, Senator. Notwithstanding the fact that we don't know exactly what we're talking about, but if we set that aside, I mean, I think Ashley's talked about levelling the playing field for participants in the industry. That's a potential benefit, removing some of the outliers in terms of the coverage. So there are potential benefits if it's designed in the right way, if it bears in mind the difference between commercial relationships in regions like this and commercial relationships in other parts of the country, for instance, large and small. There is, you know, any number of different sort of business models in our sector that need to be considered, and I think the ACCC was spot on in 2019 when they had a good look at through their own market study. They sort of noted that complexity in our industry compared to some of the more commoditised agricultural sectors. So, you know, this is a really complex issue, and I don't think that there is necessarily a simple answer, but there may be some aspects that can be codified and made mandatory that we need to have a think about.
So consultation's critical, size of enterprise is really important, and differences between regions and elements of the market, segments of the market, all need to be attended to.
That's right, and I mean, just a couple of we talked about the potential benefits. In terms of the other side of the coin, though, I mean, I see risks in terms of mandating something that becomes too rigid, that it's unable to respond to issues as they come up. That's one of the benefits of having a voluntary code with a code committee that can look at issues that need addressing, and they can address them relatively quickly and easily. The other thing that I'm conscious of always is, in the current environment in particular, we want to see more competition for wine grapes in the market, not less. And if we're getting to a point where a code is mandated that becomes burdensome, that becomes very difficult to manage and deal with, we may actually see less competition in the sector, and that's not going to be a good outcome for anyone.
But we are seeing less competition. We are seeing concentration in some elements of the wine, which is one of the reasons why we're here, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there is a difference between the commercial drivers of that consolidation and a regulatory driver.
Yeah, regulatory. We don't want to get it wrong. Wine Australia was pretty agnostic on the code. Are you opposed to a mandatory code?
We can't take, given our role under the Act, we can't take a position on the code. What we can do is support wherever we can in terms of data. One of the things we've done since the ACCC, the last time ACCC had a good look at this in 2019, is we've done a lot of work to try and build a dashboard to give that sort of some of the things that were previous speakers were talking about in terms of how do we get an indication, more transparency around the price. However, global price indicator is based on macroeconomic trends, bulk wine prices, previous prices. So that at least tries to give, you know, through data and insights, tries to level the playing field. But that's our role, really, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for remaining unclear. I see your rationale for it, and thanks very much for your evidence.
Thanks, Senator Pocock. Just a few quick questions for me before we wrap up. So we've obviously been quite focused on a very specific situation here today that involved accolades and CCW. It is the reason we're having the inquiry. Just wanted to go back. When we first spoke to you guys in Canberra earlier this year about this situation, my understanding was it wasn't reported to Australian Grape and Wine that there'd been an issue around arbitration. Is that correct?
Correct. I was unaware of that.
Yeah. Okay. So how does it occur where you get a major wine growing group, 400 or 500 wine growers and one of the biggest wine makers in the country, and they can go to an arbitration and you're not involved, Mr. Keegan and the committee? I think I'm not sure. I'm not saying it's your fault, by the way.
I understand. So normally with a dispute, the processes the disputes raised with the Secretariat.
Right.
And often it's after the fact that we become aware of those disputes because of the Secretariat deals with that individuals and puts in place the independent expert. With the informal conversations that I've had conversations about who are the independent experts and how do I go about triggering that, I direct them then to the Secretariat to talk about that. So it's not until we meet 3 times a year, and it's not until either I hear it on the grapevine or it's a meeting afterwards where we're looking at reviewing a post-vintage review of the disputes.
So how could things have been done differently or more effectively then if they'd been under the code as it exists at the moment, if there'd been, I suppose, if not a mandated process, an understood process that the Code Committee would have been informed about it, you may have been able to monitor the situation. I mean, are you aware of a third-party arbitration where someone hasn't abided by the decision of the arbitrator?
No, only subsequent to that.
Only subsequent to that.
Yeah.
When the other key witnesses today, the winemakers, hadn't been in that situation or heard of it, so maybe it is unique.
Yeah.
I'm trying to struggle with this to find out this myself.
My experience from the examples is, I think, as Fiona alluded to before, the majority of that goes to the Secretariat. The Secretariat explains the situation and encourages the grower to go back and talk one-on-one with the customer. And most of them are sorted out at that level now. We're only seeing sort of independent experts trigger on, a very small. That doesn't mean that someone hasn't gone in independently and looked at it. It just means that it hasn't gone through the dispute process. It's just gone through a normal negotiation between 2 parties. Very good point about where it's an academic discussion about what a mandated code might look like. But if it was something as simple as mandating participation in the current voluntary code with all its standards, and if it goes to a third-party dispute, hopefully that can be avoided. But if it does, and someone doesn't abide by that, then there's penalties. I mean, is that a reasonable basis to have a mandated code if you are going to get bad faith actors who aren't going to abide by third-party decisions? That doesn't seem an unreasonable expectation, Senator.
No, it doesn't, does it? I'm just trying to wonder why it does. It might seem unreasonable to some people. I think we can draw our own conclusions if that's the case. But, so obviously you have minimum prices, and I think you could include in that. But if we're just dealing with the current situation and saying you have to abide by the umpire's decision, and obviously in a very difficult, tough time for both the winemaker and the wine growers, I accept that. That might be something that, anyway, we can look at in our evidence as a committee. In terms of representation, and I'm sorry, my brain's definitely slowed down this time of the afternoon. I can't remember the exact committee that was raised with us where there was 8 to 2.
It was in the wine and...
It might have been Australian Wine Grape. Yeah. Might have been even the Code of Conduct Committee.
No, that's 4 and 4.
Okay, all right. Where you have 8 winemakers and 2 growers, and one of them growers is a winemaker as well.
So perhaps I can shed some light on that, Senator. So we have a board of 16 people and an independent chair, so it's a rather big board. Of that, there are 4 groups of 4, so there's 4 different membership committees. One is a large winemakers committee, one is a medium winemakers committee, small winemakers, and then we have a vignerons committee as well, of which Mr. Keegan is the chair of that vignerons committee. Around that table, there is no, in every decision we seek to make around that board, or the board seeks to make, I should say, generally speaking, we seek consensus on issues. So there is a real determination to get behind closed doors, to talk about the big issues, to listen to growers, to listen to winemakers, and thrash out a position that we can take forward. I think one of the things in some of the submissions that's been raised, and I think it was sort of alluded to today as well, is that maybe that balance is out of whack. The issue that I identify with that is that I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy just to talk about grape growers and winemakers in our sector. There are grape growers, there's winemakers, there's processors, it's a really diverse sector. The principle for me is to make sure that we've got the right settings there to enable that sort of professional discussion and come out the other side of that discussion with a unified voice. That's what we work to try to do.
Can I just still
Yeah,
follow
please,
up
yeah,
there?
jump in.
You would have seen submissions which suggest growers feel underrepresented and aren't heard, and also concern about not being able to go public with where they disagree. I mean, in a Senate hearing, you can publicly disagree through subsequent the way our reports are structured. Why wouldn't that be possible for you? And what do you say to the growers who feel they are underrepresented in your industry body?
Yeah, it's interesting, Senator. I guess I volunteer, and I'm continually on the hunt for volunteers to come and sit in my Vignerons committee, and everybody's welcome. And I've often said that my volunteer seat on the boards you're welcome to take as well. I feel really importantly, I sit around that table with, and I walk in that room with the fiduciary responsibility that all directors have to act in the best interest of the organisation. But without fear nor favour, our job is to sit there and prosecute whatever debate, whatever argument that is. And I sit around with some really high calibre individuals who take that philosophy into the table. I think if you just look at a number base, that's not how a board operates. That's not our responsibility when we get into that room. We debate vigorously anything that we need to do. And I've never been silenced. I've never walked out of it or thought my voice hasn't been heard. And I think great organisations, all stakeholders need to be able to answer the question as to whether their opinion counts. And I'm very confident I walk out of the AGW board and I can answer the yes to that.
Okay. Can I just check with you? Just the previous witness, Accolade, said that their third-party arbitration negotiations were covered by commercial in confidence. Is that your understanding?
Yeah. Look, and to be frank,
is that normal in a third-party arbitration in disputes within the code? Within the code,
then normally the outcomes are confidential in the context, and most contracts have got some level of confidentiality clause in them, even the standard grape supply contracts. So, I'm not aware of the details. So
no, that's okay. But is that part of the problem as to why you weren't, for example, informed? Because they were commercial in confidence negotiations? They didn't feel like they were able to or should?
That's possible. Without knowing the detail of whatever arrangement was, it's difficult for me to comment.
Yeah. Or is it that fear of retribution again?
Look, the fear of retribution is an interesting discussion. I think that we'd be naive to not think that in the duress that we're in, where there's a gating mechanism going on, and as a grower, I think about that. But at the same time, I've given a recent presentation where I said to all growers that it's okay to disagree, because you can disagree without being disagreeable. The major wine companies that I deal with 40 of them, I very rarely come across any situation where I can't have a solid conversation with them and discuss it, whether it be at an empirical science level or a commercial level, the outcomes of that. I think we need to be a bit careful about that sort of general statement in that context.
But most of us aren't murderers. We have a law that prevents us, those who are, brought to justice. So regulation's not about all the really good people who sincerely act with integrity, is it? It's about trying to make sure we regulate those who don't.
Correct, but I also, in my recent presentation, said to growers, I've got a long memory, and this cycle will turn at some point in time. Yeah. And as growers, we need to use that choice and reap what we sow from a supply chain perspective as well.
Just an academic interest to me in this discussion. There's a spot price for wholesale wine. Is there a reason why there hasn't been a futures market developed for wine? I know I might have mentioned this before, because it seems like there's pretty decent volume. I know there's concentration in terms of owners, but surely third-party participants in the market could provide a bit of depth and activity in the market, like we see in other agricultural.
Yeah, there is in every other major commodity.
Yeah, I'd love for us to be a more efficient market under the definition of efficient market, but we, definitions of an efficiency is that ubiquity of knowledge, that ease of frictionless transactions and we don't have that. It takes me, 4 years to get a grapevine in the ground and bring that to market, and it's difficult from a, I think fundamentally we're sitting here because we saw 40% of our market disappear overnight, and that's really difficult to engineer around, and
that kind of volatility would be very attractive to traders, though. I'm not saying traders are good things, by the way, but is it because there's also just a lack of information, and obviously markets rely on information to be efficient?
So my personal view on that, Senator, is that yes, that's right. I mean, traditionally we haven't had, as Mr. Cole alluded to, we haven't had that sort of coverage of what's in the ground, what's coming out, what's coming online, and when. So that would seem to me to be fundamental to any sort of futures market discussion. But the idea does resonate with me as well. I can't speak to why it hasn't happened in the past, aside from that information piece, but it's something that I think is absolutely worthy of exploration.
Because it seems to me that as a market economist, if you're coming out to a major price disclosure like we did on the second Wednesday of December, that the spot market should be moving with the current setting of the new prices. If it was efficient, you'd see that. Maybe it's a PhD topic for someone one day, but it seems to me that if you can buy that wholesale wine that's already made and then bottle it and brand it and distribute it, you'd be looking at closely at buying a wholesale product versus buying grapes and crushing them and doing it yourself. I know there's capital spent by these big wineries, but yeah, it's an interesting market.
Some of that goes on when you're in the AUSParliament. Some of that goes on. Yeah. Not to the scale that you're talking about, but you do see some of that when the trading conditions are the other way.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry we didn't have you. Well, actually, we've nearly done our full-time allotment, but we are running over time. But that is the end of the program today. So I just want to thank all the witnesses for giving their evidence and time today, especially those who have travelled to Renmark. If you've undertaken to provide additional material or notice, please provide it to the Secretary as soon as possible, no later than midday Friday, 20th of December. That concludes today's hearing. Thank you again to all the witnesses who appeared, and to the Hansard and Broadcasting for their assistance, and of course to the Secretariat as always. And the committee now stands adjourned.